academia is so far gone, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, that it is incapable of reforming itself internally. There is no internal opposition left. The question is not how do we reform the universities? The question is how do we protect society from the universities?
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States, with a conversation about the anti-Israel and pro-Hamas protests that swept across American college campuses in the last 7 months, with William Jacobson of Legal Insurrection, a primary source of information about the spread of toxic woke ideology and the battle for free speech. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. With the academic year ending, the campus protests against Israel are dying down. The tents in the pro-Hamas encampments are being packed up, and the chants of "From the River to the Sea, Free Palestine, and Globalize the Intifada" are dying down. The privileged students who have embraced the cause of Israel's extinction have gone back home, left for vacations, or are preparing for their summer internships. And the college administrations, those who appeased the protesters, as well as the few that stood up to them, are pondering how to navigate the next surge of woke activism in the fall, when the students and the outside leftist organizers and agitators return for the fall semester in what is likely to be a still heated atmosphere of debate about events in the Middle East, with the added frisson of hysteria that is almost certainly to be part of American academic life as well as society in the last months of the presidential election. Both they and the rest of us who looked on in dismay as the institutions of higher education in the United States became hotbeds not just of leftist activism, there was nothing new about that, but the epicenter of a new and unprecedented surge in American anti-Semitism. At this point, it's clear that the problem is greater than just who is leading some of these institutions, or whether they were quick or slow to condemn anti-Semitism at them, or to deal with the protests that not only violated their rules, but created a hostile and unsafe environment for Jewish students. Part of the problem can be blamed on the distorted coverage of the war against Hamas that Israel is waging, in which absurd and false civilian casualty statistics have been used to promote a narrative about genocide. Part of the problem is also the funding that many of these schools get from the Arab and Muslim world that help foster hostility against Israel and Zionism. The role of foreign students is part of it, as is the role of outside organizers of the protests from openly anti-Semitic groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, which has ties to pro-terror organizations. There's also the question of the funding such organizations have gotten from leftist philanthropies, such as billionaire George Soros's Open Society Foundation. But at the heart of the problem is the way the woke ideologies of critical race theory and intersectionality, which have become not merely dominant in the academy, but a new orthodoxy from which none may dissent without serious consequences. These toxic ideas are part of a broad neo-Marxist anti-American worldview that not only seeks to create a permanent divide on race between so-called white oppressors and people of color who are their victims in American society, but also because they wrongly define Jews and Israel as white oppressors. That leads the largely student populations of ignorant people, even at elite campuses, to believe that the cause of Palestine and even Hamas and the war against the one Jewish state on the planet is one that all right-thinking people should support. With such views held almost uniformly by college professors, a group where conservatives are practically extinct, it is not surprising that this has turned American colleges and universities into places where calls for Israel's destruction are not just tolerated, but popular and considered proof of good character rather than of prejudice and bigotry. What then do we do about this? Can American higher education be saved from the anti-Semitic surge? Can Jewish students be protected without violating the free speech rights of others? Is defunding these schools and their replacement by alternatives viable options? And how can liberal Jews, who are outraged about the impact of woke ideology on their children's lives, go on supporting or tolerating these ideologies with respect to other issues? To discuss all this, we're pleased to have back with us today a man who has done as much as anyone to raise awareness of the destructive forces on American college campuses and the fight to defend Western principles that are under siege there. William A. Jacobson is a clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School, where he has taught since 2007. In 2008, he founded the Legal Insurrection website. In 2019, he launched Legal Insurrection Foundation, a nonprofit research and investigative group focusing on promoting free speech and open dialogue, capitalism, and free enterprise, and understanding the intersectional left. In 2021, he created criticalrace.org, a website that catalogs critical race training in higher education, medical schools, military academies, and elite private schools through a series of interactive maps. And in 2023, he launched equalprotect.org, the Equal Protection Project, which takes legal actions to fight racial and other discrimination done in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. William Jacobson, welcome back to Top Story.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you the question that is on the minds of many Americans today after the last 7 months of campus protests. How did support for Hamas and for the destruction of Israel become so popular on American college campuses? And why is the cause of Palestine now not merely fashionable, but somehow dominant on the left?
There's a lot wrapped into that question. I think you have to view this as a continuum that took place over 20 to 30 years on the campuses. Many different factors. I'll just rattle off some of them, and then we can talk about additional ones. So one of them is there's been a purge of dissenting viewpoints on college campuses. There is no diversity of viewpoint, at least at the quote-unquote elite level, but even not the elite level when it comes to the humanities and the social sciences. Conservatives have not been hired for 20 plus years. Pro-Israel professors have not been hired for 20 plus years, maybe 30 years. And so what you get on campuses, you have a faculty which drives a lot of the issues, which is a monoculture. It's an echo chamber, which is in many ways anti-capitalist, in many ways anti-American, views us as the source of the world's problems, views us as irredeemably racist, baked into our system, is some of the phraseology they sort of use. The anti-Israel component is part of that ideology, that Israel is held out as the example of everything that's gone wrong in the United States, but implanted into the Middle East. So when they have an anti-colonial ideology on campuses, when they talk about white supremacy, when they talk about, indigenous rights, things like that, they use Israel as their mutual object of hate. So the way I would describe it is that it's not so much that they hate Israel, which they do. it's not so much that they hate Jews, which many of them do. It is that Israel is a very useful organizing mechanism for the people who hate Western society, Western civilization, hate the United States, and hate capitalism. Israel is something around which groups who have absolutely nothing in common can come together and hate. And that would be what's frequently referred to as the Red-Green Alliance. So the Marxists and the anarchists and the Islamists, who in many ways are the exact opposite ideologically, all come together to hate the Jews and hate Israel. And so that has developed over 30 years. So it didn't start on October 7th, but it bubbled up on October 7th.
Yeah, I think that's all pretty true. And I guess you're saying that the fashionable push for Palestine is really just an extension of the same arguments Americans have been having about critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I guess from the point of, Jews, Jewish students, Jewish parents, this development is even more dangerous because of the way it specifically targets Jews as opposed to generic white privileged DEI villains, which is kind of like that goes with that's part of the normal rhetoric. But as they have always been, Jews are the canaries in the coal mine. But also they're much more vulnerable than your generic, sort of white privileged establishment.
Right, and Cornell's a great example where I teach. We are required now at the start of all events to recite a land acknowledgement, acknowledging effectively that we are on stolen land from the Cayuga Indian tribe. But they're not willing to actually do anything about it. So they're not willing to decolonize Cornell. My view is if you really believe that, and it's not just virtue signaling, then leave. Cornell should vacate and give it back to the Native Americans, but they won't do that. So Israel becomes a very convenient object for them to attack because it allows them to virtue signal. It allows them to uphold their decolonization ideology without having to sacrifice anything themselves. And so,
yeah, well, there's a certain, like almost humorous irony there because, Palestinians want to basically turn the clock back 100 years. I guess those who would try to, force Cornell to give up its campus or trying to turn the clock back to the Revolutionary War and the bad decision that the tribes of upstate and Western New York made in siding with the British rather than the Americans. But it's real. That's really true. This is a free pass in terms of their decolonial ideology. And of course, the facts, such as that Jews are actually the indigenous people of the land of Israel, the conflict between Jews and Arabs is not racial. Jews and Arabs are pretty much the same race. That doesn't seem to enter into this. Nobody seems interested in those facts.
No, and that's the ideology. Some of them, I think, believe the ideology. They believe that Israel is somehow different. But many of them just go along with it, particularly the students. And that's why the faculty are so important. At Cornell and elsewhere, but I know Cornell, there is a relentless dehumanization of Israel, a relentless dehumanization of Israeli Jews. It's been going on for as long as I've been on campus, which is close to 17 years. It has picked up steam post-George Floyd. It has picked up steam post-Black Lives Matter. But that is what is happening. So you have a core group of faculty. I can't put an exact number on it. I would guess 30 to 40. Now, that's not a large percentage out of the total faculty population, but they are the ones who are vocal on the issue. There is not a week that goes by, or barely a week that goes by, that some faculty department doesn't have an anti-Israel program. Now, they don't say this is an anti-Israel program, but it's a program to demonize Israel. I cannot recall a single program sponsored by an academic department at Cornell that reasonably could be called pro-Israel. To the extent there are any programs that are pro-Israel, they're put on by other groups, by outside groups. The faculty who are active on this issue have put their foot on the scale on the campus ideology. And they drive a lot of this. They've been at the encampment that Cornell had. They work with the groups on campus who are anti-Israel. They work with the student groups, I mean. And so really, I think the faculty drives a lot of this. And that's a problem because this was 20 to 30 years in the making. And it's going to take 20 to 30 years. The handful of faculty on Cornell's campus who I think could reasonably be called pro-Israel and who are willing to talk publicly about it, you can count on one hand, and they're aging out. Okay, I just turned 65, and I'm probably the youngest of the cohort. If you look at any of the younger faculty, they are almost uniformly either silent or anti-Israel. There is no pro-Israel younger cohort at Cornell, and that sends a message to the students. It sets a tone for the campus, and the administration, which is going to be changing soon because the president recently announced she'd be resigning, but the administration has been opposed to any attempt to diversify the faculty. They say, well, we can't get involved in who departments hire. There's shared governance here. Well, for 20 to 30 years, that shared governance has resulted in no viewpoint diversity. They've got to do something, and that's really, I think, the core of the problem. The administrators, I think, are relatively indifferent, but to the extent they have a viewpoint that they're willing to express, I think it leans towards the anti-Israel camp.
Yeah, well, I think it's become axiomatic that the students who chant from the river to the sea not only don't understand what that means, they can't identify either body of water. How ignorant are these, ideological faculty members as well? Is it just ideology? Do they just buy the sort of neo-Marxist line? Or, are they really true believers? How much of this is sort of intellectual fashion and how much of it is sort of dialectic of a real movement?
Well, I think the ones who are outspoken on it and activists on it are true believers. I think that there are a lot of faculty who just stay silent. A lot of faculty don't want to get involved in the issue. But the ones who do almost completely believe it, do believe the rhetoric. The students, I think it's a little different. I think there is a core group of student activists who believe it. Students for Justice in Palestine, I think, believes it. And so there's a very activist group of students. A lot of the students, though, it is true, it's just become fashionable. It's become the thing to do. You have to be anti-Israel on campuses if you are going to be socially accepted. And that's just a fact. And that's why a lot of the reaction that the American Jewish community has had over the last decade or two, the quote-unquote pro-Israel community, Jewish and non-Jewish, has not really understood that arguing the merits doesn't work. This is a cultural problem, which has grown worse with social media, that in order to be accepted in the culture on many campuses, including the campuses where are problems, you have to be anti-Israel. It is a box you have to check. Whether they understand it or not, my guess is many of them don't have a deep understanding. They hear figures and death tolls cited in the media, which are often completely fabricated, and they go with it. It's the thing to do. So while I've seen those videos of students not knowing which sea and which river, and I think there's something to that, I think there is an ideological group who understands it very well and has nefarious goals and is, in any revolution, the revolution is led by 2% of the population. 2% of the population can really move the population, and that's what we're seeing happen.
Or smaller, if you listen to Lenin, but, that worked for him. One of the issues that has become a source of controversy is the question of the role of the funding of these protests. How important is outside funding, as well as the presence of outside organizers from radical groups, both leftist and pro-terror, like as you just mentioned, the anti-Semitic Students for Justice in Palestine, in creating the chaos that we've just witnessed?
Well, I think there's the organizing and then there's the funding. So I don't know how much of the funding goes directly to student groups. People will be shocked to learn that probably the biggest direct funder of anti-Israel student groups are the universities themselves. Because if you're a student group and you are able to register as an official student group, you get funding from the university. At least you do at Cornell. And so a lot of the funding comes from our tuition dollars because these are registered student groups. But that can't explain all of it. There's no question, and there's been a lot written lately about funding that goes to kind of dark money operations like Westpac in Westchester that seem to serve as a filter and a screen behind which groups who operate off campuses but help, like Students for Justice in Palestine, get their money. So there's no question there's a lot of money flowing into the space, but it's very...
And honestly, these protests don't really require that much money. This is not like a political campaign where you're buying TV ads. I mean, how much do tents and signs and, spray paint cans cost?
Yeah, I think the coordinating mechanism is the more important. That I don't think that Students for Justice in Palestine says they have 300 branches on campuses. That may be true, and I think that helps explain how in a single day this pops up everywhere, because they get the messaging out, they get the templates for posters out, they get all of this out, and they coordinate it. So there's a lot of coordination. It's coming from many different sources, but we have to acknowledge students are still showing up for these things. So it's one thing to throw a rally, it's another thing to get people to show up. And because of how demonized Israel has become, and because of how it is being anti-Israel is a box you need to check, and you need to be able to take a selfie of yourself at the encampment, and you need to virtue signal about how much you've sacrificed for the Palestinians, when, of course, in fact, you've sacrificed nothing. And so there is coordination, there is money, there is organizing, but there also is this cultural phenomenon that is going on, and we have to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think you're right that the big problem is the ideology and the atmosphere, but it has become a source of some interest as to how this is happening. Now, when the building takeover at Columbia University, when they finally, the police finally threw the protesters out of Hamilton Hall at Columbia, place where I spent some of my misspent youth, they found that a lot of those people there weren't students. How much of a factor is that? Or are we focusing too much about the idea of sort of Antifa-style organizers, roaming around like Bolsheviks trying to force, World War I Russian army to desert?
Well, it's all of the above. I mean, there's a lot of things going on here. We can't oversimplify it. There's no question that particularly in cities, schools that are in cities, the outside activists have played an outsized role. And you saw that by the arrest where, a third of the people arrested are actually students. And you have professional organizers out there directing them. So there's no question that that is part of it. There's a lot of things going on here, and I don't think we can point to any one thing. But even at Cornell, not so much this time that I've observed, but in the past, a lot of our problems have been the result of Ithaca activists who are not enrolled at the school coming onto campus and stirring up trouble. I remember it. I may be off on the year. I can't remember. It was 2014 or 17, but there were Ithaca activists who came and stoked intimidation of Jewish students, pro-Israel students on Cornell's campus. One of them actually ended up getting charged for assault and battery. I don't know what happened to that case, but we've got the video of her getting in people's faces and trying to provoke them to hit her, literally inches from their face, screaming at them. And those were off-campus activists. So even at Cornell, which is fairly rural, the organized anti-Israel movement, the Jewish Voice for Pieces of the world, the Code Pinks of the world, who get a lot of money and a lot of donations, are heavily involved in these things. We see it in videos from Capitol Hill, where Code Pink activists are harassing congressmen and senators in the hallways. And so there's a lot going on here. And we
not labeled an insurrection, but right.
Right. And so we've got to understand that there are a lot of factors here, but at its core, it's a cultural problem that we have a generation who gets their news from TikTok, who understands very simple themes. The other side is very good at creating very simple themes. They just keep repeating it again and again, genocide, genocide, genocide. You can't go anywhere without a sign about genocide. And that sinks in. They find a small, narrow, focused message, and they just repeat it endlessly. Whereas we're trying to have a discussion. Let's talk about history. Let's talk about the last 100 years. Let's talk about who the real indigenous peoples are. Yeah, that's an hour-long conversation. Accusing someone of genocide takes about 3 seconds. And so just messaging-wise, the other side is extremely good at the messaging.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Now, you've already mentioned this, that part of the problem is the utter lack of diversity in college faculties, with conservatives being either rare or extinct, especially in many disciplines. While many of these institutions were always liberal, I referenced Columbia, which was pretty liberal when I went there back in the Ice Age, but how did they become almost uniformly leftist? And what is more important in making that happen? The culling of the faculty through the tenure process, or the imposition of the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion that has created a vast class of leftist bureaucrats who control admissions as well as some aspects of hiring? We haven't really mentioned them yet.
The answer is yes. Okay, to all of the above.
Yeah, right.
That, like I said, it's really institutional capture is the best way of looking at it. That the left understood that if you can capture the education system, you can really shape a generation. And that's why Bill Ayers, Obama's mentor, who helped him launch his first campaign, went into academia. It's why the students in Harvard Law School in the early 1980s, when I was there, who were anti-Israel before it was fashionable to be anti-Israel, who developed the tactic of forming coalitions of color against Israel, which predated even critical race theory. The inventor of the term critical race theory and intersectionality was my classmate. And I saw how those student groups operated, that they understood that if you can take over education, you can shape a generation. And the most radical students from my class at Harvard Law School went into academia. Everybody else went into private law practice. And we gave our kids to them. Turned our kids over to the radical left who had taken over education. And so part of it is just straight out institutional capture. They understood, and we didn't, how to do it. And when they took the way they capture the institution is they get themselves on the hiring committees. They take over the hiring committees, and they only hire their own. Perfect example is Hamilton College, where I went to college. It used to be a very traditional, you could call it liberal arts, but not necessarily liberal education. Absorbed Kirkland College, which was a radical 60s sort of girls' school, and we were a guys' school, and we went co-ed. And that radical faculty took over the Hamilton College faculty, such that 20 years later, it was as radical as Oberlin College or Wesleyan or Columbia. And because they only hired their own. We think that, oh, that's not fair. You shouldn't not hire somebody because you don't agree with them. These people just don't pass them on. They never get an interview. They never get past the process. So it's not even so much tenure process. To get to tenure, you have to have been hired. They're not hiring people. I've had many people tell me that they would love to write for my website, but they're scared to death that if they have anything conservative or right of center on their CV, on their resume, they will never get hired. And so they keep it off. The PhD students who wanted to write for us, and they just know they can't. And so that's what happened. It's institutional capture.
Right. Well, it's a process where people, even where people are in disagreement with the new leftist orthodoxy, they are silenced if they wish to work in academia, and silenced, in order to stay in it. I suppose, you could stay silent for a while until you get tenure, but then being the sort of the lone non-leftist wolf, that's not much fun. I mean, that's talk about, even faculty members are subjected to social pressures too, aren't they?
Right. And there's a lot of perks that go along with that you're not entitled to. And so promotion from associate professor to full professor, okay? Promotion, within other things you get, perks of the office, benefits, grants, support staff, all those other things are things that are used as pressure points. And I'm saying it because this is what people have related to me. It doesn't really affect me so much at the law school, but within the university itself. The fear doesn't stop the day you get hired, and it doesn't stop even the day you get tenure, that there is enormous social pressure. And then, as you mentioned, you're very much alone. You probably aren't alone, but among the people who speak up, you're alone. And then you worry about getting targeted, getting called various names, various isms, etc., because you speak out. And so that really, there is a reign of terror on campuses that affects faculty, which means that few dissenting voices get hired. The dissenting voices that there are tend to get silenced or snuffed out by an elaborate system where you have anonymous bias reporting. Your career can be all but ruined by anonymous complaints about you. And so it's really a terrible situation. The way I view it, and I've been trying to sound the alarm for people, is that academia is so far gone, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, that it is incapable of reforming itself internally. There is no internal opposition left. And society needs to understand that, and needs to understand that at least in the short term, the question is not how do we reform the universities? The question is how do we protect society from the universities? And that's something that I don't think people have come to grips with.
Yeah, that's a very important way to put it. What are college administrators and presidents more afraid of these days? The possible loss of funding from outraged alumni who have seen these protests and, seen the way Jewish students are treated and are angry, or the anger of faculty, administrators, and students on campus, which can sometimes be more adept at forcing a university president to resign than even some big givers?
Well, I think based on their public performance, based on what we've all been able to observe about it, they seem to be extremely afraid of the students. They seem to be afraid of their offices being occupied. They seem to be afraid of encampments on campus. I have to hand it to these students and their facilitators like SJP. They understood the pressure points. And you are seeing administration after administration completely capitulate to these encampments when there's no reason to. So I think they are afraid of the students. To some extent, they might be afraid of faculty. I don't really think they're afraid of donors. Sorry, big donors. They take you for granted. They have no respect for you. It doesn't matter if your name's on a building or how much money you've donated. That may enable you to get a phone call with the president. But when push comes to shove, they really don't care. They're happy to take your money, but you're not getting the influence you think you're getting by donating. What I do think they fear tremendously is cutoff of government funding, federal funding particularly, but also state funding. That is the hammer over their head. Now, of course, the Biden administration is not going to wield that hammer, is not going to bring it down on them. But if we get a Trump administration, hopefully they will. That is the big money. If Harvard or another school were to lose their federal funding, they very well might collapse. Okay, they're not
even Harvard with its $1 billion endowment.
Doesn't matter because a lot of those are restricted funds. They've got to pay people this week salaries or next week or whatever the pay cycle is in Massachusetts. Harvard needs to pay people today. They can't poach endowed restricted funds to do that. At least they can't do it legally. So there is a real question. And the best example of that, and I'm forgetting the name of the case, but when the military had the don't ask, don't tell policy, Harvard Law School refused to allow military recruiters on campus. And there was an amendment, I think it was the Solomon Amendment, which said that no federal funding for any university that does not treat military recruiters on an equal standing with other recruiters. So you don't have to allow the military to recruit, but you do have to if you allow others. And that went to court, and the Supreme Court ruled that that was constitutional, that amendment, because you have no constitutional right to federal funding. And lo and behold, when Harvard was faced with the cutoff of federal fundings after that Supreme Court case went against them, and that would have been a cutoff to all of Harvard University, not just to Harvard Law School. Their principles all of a sudden weren't worth very much, and they capitulated. So that if Congress were to pass, or the president by executive order were to implement restrictions on the universities as to their access to federal funding, not their free speech rights. Supreme Court's already held that you can condition federal funding on various factors. In fact, we do it all the time. You have to certify you're complying with the anti-discrimination laws to get those federal funds. So we condition federal funding all the time. If it were to be used in a more targeted manner to put at risk the federal funding of these universities, look at the numbers. It far exceeds what they get from donors. So I think that is, what they are truly afraid of. And that may be the only solution here, if there is a solution, which is an outside imposition on the universities. As much as we didn't want it to happen, didn't want it to get to this point, the universities, at least at certain levels and in certain categories, are so far gone that federal government intervention may be the only thing to bring them back towards the center and towards their educational mission.
Yeah, that's very important. I want to get back to that in a moment. But first I want to ask you, one of the demands of the protesters has been for schools to divest from investments that are linked to Israel. That seems to be a rather unlikely event for most schools in most respects because of the fiduciary responsibilities of those involved in investing their money, as well as the fact that embracing discriminatory BDS policies is illegal in some states, including some where some of these schools are located. But are we closer to normalizing BDS after some schools appeased the protesters by promising a discussion about divestment? I know Brown did that, so did Rutgers. Have they won a bit on this, even if they're not likely to get their way in the end?
Well, I think people need to understand that BDS is a tactic. They say that all the time. And it took me a number of years, because we had been following the BDS movement really from the start of my website, 2008. They would always say BDS is a tactic. And I never really understood what that meant. And what it means is they really don't care if these schools invest in Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. They literally do not care. What they care about is that the campus and our society spend months and years talking about how bad Israel is. So it's a delegitimization process. People should not get obsessed with the specific thing they are trying to boycott today. Could be Sabra hummus, which, by the way, is made in Northern Virginia, but has a connection to an Israeli company, even though the brand is owned by Pepsi. They really don't care if Sabra hummus is provided in the dining hall. It is a tactic to get the entire campus to delegitimize Israel. And that's what we need to focus on. And the remedy for this is not just pushback in opposing it. That is necessary. But the remedy here is to expand our ties with Israel. So rather than, banning something, rather than punishing something, announce that we're going to expand our ties with Israeli universities. We're going to expand our ties. We're going to create new programs. We're going to, we're not going to fall prey to their tactic. And that's one of the things. So people need to understand that they have made progress on their boycotting. The universities, university presidents who've given in are completely shameless and lacking in integrity, and it's happened multiple places. One of the worst examples I've seen is Northwestern, where the university agreed to a discriminatory scholarship program and housing program in order to get them to shut down the encampment. The university announced that they would award 5 scholarships to Palestinian students. That violates the civil rights laws against national origin discrimination and other types of discrimination. And the same with housing. They announced they would create housing for MENA, Middle East, North Africa, and Muslim students on campus. That also is a violation of the law. And one of the entities I run, Equal Protection Project, filed a civil rights complaint against that. But that's how terrible the universities are. They sacrificed the civil rights of other students in order to appease people who were illegally and unlawfully and in violation of school property and school rules occupying school property. Harvard and others have agreed, Brown, you mentioned, Brown has agreed to put to a vote of the trustees a divestment from investments in companies dealing with Israel, only because of the encampments. This gets back to what I'm saying. We cannot trust the universities, be they the faculty or the administrations, to do the right thing, because they won't, and they don't. And that's why outside pressure, as much as I wish it didn't have to take place, that's why outside pressure is the only thing that can protect our society from what's going on the campuses.
Mm. Now, there are some optimists among conservatives and the Jewish community that were willing to claim that the embarrassment of the 3 elite university presidents at a congressional hearing in December and the firing of 2 of them was a sign that there is significant pushback against woke school administrators and that this is a harbinger of an eventual return to sanity. But as long as DEI, critical race theory, and intersectionality are the new secular religious orthodoxy of the academy, is change even possible? I guess, what you've been just telling me is the answer is no.
The answer is no, that unless we change the culture on the campuses, unless we get away from the obsession with race, the obsession with building coalitions based on race, the obsession with viewing our society as the great evil in the world, unless we can cure that problem on campus, who's sitting at the top of this heap really ultimately doesn't matter, because that's what's driving the discussion and the ideology. That's why I just had a column, an op-ed in the New York Post where he said, if Cornell is going to recover, it's got to get rid of DEI, and that the president leaving is the opportunity for the trustees to seize the day and get rid of this program she installed 4 years ago on the campus. 4 years ago, July, the president imposed an anti-racism agenda on the campus, which has been completely destructive. It's got to be gotten rid of completely, not tweaked around the edges. When there was blowback this fall about what was happening at Cornell, she said, well, we'll add an antisemitism module to it. Well, why wasn't it there to begin with? I mean, that's the proof positive about how destructive the DEI has been to the Jewish community, that Cornell didn't even have an anti-Semitism module and was going to add one after students were chanting for an intifada on campus, and one student who's now in federal custody threatened to slit the throats and shoot Jewish students. So that's what it took to add a module on anti-Semitism. And by the way, at the same time, she said they're going to add a module on Islamophobia, which is not a serious problem on the Cornell campus, or statistically is not a serious problem in the United States. So they couldn't even give the Jewish community at Cornell a week or two to mourn what happened on October 7th. They couldn't even understand what a unique moment it was in Jewish history, the greatest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, by people who have a Nazi ideology, by people who did it in the name of Islam. And so when people who committed those crimes in the name of Islam and slaughtered Jews wholesale and mutilated and raped and all the other things we've seen, when that happened, Cornell's reaction and other universities is to say, well, we're going to, fight against not just anti-Semitism, but Islamophobia at the same time. They couldn't even give us 2 weeks to mourn as Jews, not at Cornell, not anywhere. They had to lop into it their intersectional approach to the world. And that's how perverted and sick the campuses have become.
Mm. Now, you opened this discussion a little bit ago by saying, and I think it's quite true, that the way to force change on the campuses is for the federal government to penalize schools that are basically breaking the law. Now, in this case, we're discussing the creation of hostile environments for Jews. And the way to stop them is to essentially defund them under the provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. That was the conceit of the Antisemitism Awareness Act passed by the House a couple of weeks ago, which also enshrines the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as the way to judge whether anti-Semitism has occurred. But in addition to left-wingers opposing this for ideological reasons, many influential conservatives, I might have, just one example, Chris Rufo wrote a great book about, what's going on in terms of woke ideology. They're also opposed. FIRE is opposed, the group that really works for free speech on campuses, because they view it as a potential violation of free speech akin to what the left does. I think that's wrong, but where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that definition. Why are we not allowed to define anti-Semitism? We define everything else. In order to fight it, you need to know what it is. That's very different than saying you will be criminalized or you will be punished for violating this, by your speech as opposed to your conduct. So I don't see anything wrong with the definition. I think the definition's been distorted. If you look at really where it mostly comes down to is the examples listed in the definition. But if you look at the preface to the examples, it specifically says, depending on the context, these can be considered anti-Semitic. Not that merely saying them is anti-Semitic, but depending on the context. And we know that that's true. So one of the problems that we face in fighting anti-Semitism is people play word games with us. Well, I'm a Semite. How can I be anti-Semitic? I'm a Semite. All these word games get played. And if we're willing to define racism, if we're willing to define disability, if we're willing to define other things, why aren't we willing to define anti-Semitism? To me, the issue is then, what do you do with it once you've defined it? And that's where I think people are mistaken. To my understanding, this bill does not criminalize it. It is simply meant to enshrine a definition which does not make those specific examples illegal. It simply cites them as examples in a particular context. So I'm not as upset by it. And, if we had a system, and this is something I address all the time with regard to the campuses, all of a sudden, post-October 7th, all these campuses have discovered the First Amendment.
Right.
And so you have elaborate systems on campuses to monitor speech, to report speech, to punish speech, to require that certain terminology be used. You can be punished if you don't use someone's preferred pronoun. All these things. Then all of a sudden, people are marching through the campus with bullhorns calling for an intifada. And, oh, no, we can't do that. That's free speech. That's First Amendment. So the people complaining about this act, if they were consistent and if they had the power to say anything that is consistent or permitted under the First Amendment, it goes. I'd be completely fine with that. But that's not the reality of campuses. One of the reasons we're trying to define anti-Semitism is because we define everything else on campuses. And, we define everything else when it comes to the discrimination laws. Why can't we define that one thing? And that becomes extremely important because among the word games we get groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, anti-Zionist fringe Jewish groups.
Who traffic in anti-Semitic blood libels, I might add.
Right. And so, yeah, it's a problem because the anti-Semitism is one of these shape-shifting, sort of morphing things. And if you don't have any working definition of it, how do you address it? And how do you recognize it when it happens? And so, no, I don't think someone should go to jail for violating that. And I do believe that a lot of, what we punish in society should be permitted. I think the way to change viewpoints is to have that discussion, not to push them underground, not to push them, in the dark reaches of the internet. But that's not the society we live in. We live in a society where we define things. Why is it that anti-Semitism is the one thing we're not allowed to define?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think those who complain that somehow, punishing schools for anti-Semitism is a restriction of free speech, and conservatives who have been saying this, basically, are they in favor of repealing the Civil Rights Act? Because we're still going to continue punishing school. There would be no doubt that a school would be punished for allowing, KKK rallies on their campuses, or in some ways enshrining racism, and being sort of agnostic about whether that's okay. We know that would happen. That there wouldn't be any doubt about that, and there would be no debate. So why are Jews? Why can the left target Jews, the left and Islamists target Jews with impunity when we already, and we're going to continue punishing other acts of discriminatory behavior as opposed to just merely free speech?
Yeah, well, public universities are bound by the First Amendment, so there's more freedom at those universities than at private schools like Cornell. And so I think there is a difference. I think that the famous Charlottesville rally with the tiki torches was allowed to take place because it was on a public university. But we're talking about something different than free speech. We're talking about compliance with the civil rights laws as relates to your receipt of federal funding. Okay? So we're not talking about criminalizing speech. We're frankly not even talking about criminalizing anything, not even conduct. We're talking about whether you can take federal money, which has as a precondition that you comply with federal civil rights laws, and then not comply with them and keep the money. That's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about criminalizing conduct or even criminalizing speech. We're talking about you took this money based on a promise to abide by the civil rights laws. You're not doing it. So that again goes back to that example I mentioned about the anti-boycott laws. About the military recruiting at Harvard and the Solomon Amendment. You don't have to take the federal money. But if you want the federal money, you've got to comply with the Civil Rights Act, Title IX you have to comply with. And if you don't want to comply with them, you're not going to jail, but you're not entitled to the money. Why is it different for anti-Semitism than everything else that we condition aid on?
Right. And federal money is, as you've already told us, the lifeblood of every university and college in this country. I mean,
it is. And
they all need it.
They need it. They could not survive on it. And it's not just outright grants. It's people being able to apply for federal funding for different research projects and things like that. All of those make you sign statements saying, I'm going to comply with the anti-discrimination laws. There are elaborate bureaucracies at Cornell and elsewhere to monitor these grant programs to make sure they are in compliance because they don't want to have to give the money back. And so why is it different? Why is it that the only thing we're not going to do that for is anti-Semitism? We'll do it for racism. We'll do it for sexism. We'll do it for disability. We'll do it for all these other things, but we won't do it for anti-Semitism because all of a sudden it's an offense to the First Amendment if you address it when it comes to anti-Semitism. Well, it's not an offense to the First Amendment if you condition federal funding on not implementing a racially hostile environment. It should be the same for not having an anti-Semitic hostile environment. But in order to understand it, you need to define it. So that's really the issue. And I think it's very odd that anti-Semitism is the one thing we're not allowed to define.
Yeah. Now, you've already talked a little about the real prospects for rolling back the woke tide in academia right now. And you've mentioned change in Washington, that might make a meaningful difference. And that certainly would be true if the Department of Justice or a new Department of Education were to not merely investigate, as the Department of Education does, the various complaints that are raised against them, but actually start, putting some muscle into it. But some people are also seeking to create new institutions. One example is the University of Austin, which has gotten a lot of publicity. And, people involved with that, like the historian Noel Ferguson, say it's basically just time to abandon the existing institutions and try to create new ones. It's a great idea, but the thing is, it's taken a great effort even to create that one, which will, is going to open its doors in the fall. But is that sort of, a not an option for, in terms of getting any real results?
I don't think it's a national option. I'm all in favor. If somebody has the funding and the ability to do it, great. But to replicate our university and college system, billions doesn't even begin to touch it, okay? Hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, the money is not going to be there. It's not reasonable. I think it's more important and more fruitful on a national scale to recapture the institutions that have been captured. And to do that, unfortunately, you're going to need outside pressure. You're going to need reforms. You'll probably need reform to the hiring system. You'll need reform to this concept of shared governance, where the faculty is given huge autonomy in terms of hiring. It's been abused. It's a great concept. I'm all in favor of the concept, but it has been abused to purge academia of anyone who's right of center or even moderately pro-Israel. So the faculty around the country have abused the privileges they've been given. So I don't have a lot of sympathy when people say, and at a faculty senate meeting, at Cornell, when an Israeli professor on the faculty, of course, in the STEM, in physics, not in the humanities, but an Israeli physicist at Cornell, and this is all recorded, it's open, it's not private, said to the president and the provost that it is so one-sided here, anti-Israel among the faculty, and it is so terrible. What are you going to do about it? The response was, there's nothing we can do about it. What do you want us to do? Tell people what to think and say? So there is no willingness to address the fact that the autonomy given to faculty in the hiring process has been completely abused. It has been used to drive out opposing viewpoints. That needs to end. I'm sorry. I wish it could continue. I wish people had been more reasonable. I wish it had not been used as a hammer over the heads of people who are capitalist, pro-American, pro-Israel, pro-Western, pro-capitalist. I wish it hadn't been abused that way, but it has been, and we've got to wake up to that. The idealistic notion of academic freedom and autonomy has been abused in the hiring process to do away with academic freedom. And that's why it's always interesting that the BDS people, the people who want an academic boycott of Israel, who want to violate the academic freedom, not just of Israelis, but of Americans who want to interact with Israelis. So the worst perpetrators of a breach of academic freedom, the boycott people, scream bloody murder about their own academic freedom if you pass a law that says they can't get federal funding to do that. So I think that academia is so out of control at so many levels. Society needs to wake up.
Yeah, I think one of the, we're speaking, it's mid-May. Most schools are already, their semesters are over, graduations are taking place. So now we're looking forward to what will happen in the fall when all of these students and faculty return to campuses. What do you think the prospects are for, a more peaceful fall? Have any lessons been learned? And I think one factor that may figure into, the hysteria is that this fall we're also going to be in the last months of a presidential election where a lot of people are going to be triggered about the possible outcome. What do you expect happening in September?
I think September and October are going to be a wild ride. I think that the summer is going to be used for organizing by the same groups who organized the encampments. I would not be surprised to see more encampments because universities have capitulated. I think it was Harvard announced today, no punishment for anybody, no matter what you did. Okay, so we've taught them the wrong lessons. We've taught them that these tactics work and there's no responsibility that's going to attach to them. Cornell has temporarily suspended, I think, 6 students. I'd be shocked if that holds. Maybe it will. My guess is that will be lifted. So I think we're going to be in for a even more organized, larger movement in the fall. Of course, some of that might be dependent on the news cycle. Let's see what happens in the next 2 to 3 months in Gaza and the Middle East and the presidential election. But if we're heading into September and Donald Trump is still up double digits over Joe Biden, and Israel has defeated Hamas, okay, and has, killed the, heroes of this movement, the Hamas heroes of this movement. And if Sinwar is, being put on trial for crimes against humanity, let's hope that happens. So that could feed a lot of it. So we don't know, but I think if knowing what we know now, it's going to be a very hot fall on campuses.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Well, Bill, thanks so much for joining us today and for all of your insights. You can follow your work on legalinsurrection.org. Go there, find out all about what he and his group are doing. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.